The first thing that I want to bring up, Ryan, is I want to bring up rush offense against rush defense. And this is probably the matchup to me that is most important for Notre Dame. And not even just from a keys to victory standpoint. We'll discuss that more tomorrow. But just from a what are we going to learn about this football team standpoint, Ryan? Because when you look at BYU, they have struggled the last couple of years against the run. And it's not just this year. It's not just, well, they've had some guys out. Like Tyler Batty was out against Utah State last week. That matters. He's, in my opinion, and I believe yours as well, he's their best defensive lineman.
Oh, yeah.
They didn't have him last week. But they haven't been good even when he has played at stopping the run. And we saw it this year. And we also saw it last year too, Ryan, because this was a team that wasn't great at stopping the run last season. They're giving up, as we see here, 159.8 yards per game. Well, last year in this matchup, last year on their rush defense, they gave up 157 rushing yards per game. And in the last 2 years, we've talked about how they're 8-2 against Power 5 teams. Actually, no, I'm sorry, 7-2 against Power 5 teams. They were 6-1 last year. They're 1-1 so far this year, so 7-2. In those 9 games, Notre Dame or BYU has given up over 180 rushing yards per game, even in wins. And then in the 4 losses they've had the last 2 years, they've given up 219.5 rushing yards per game. So you want to beat BYU? Run the football, right? And they've been really inconsistent at stopping the run. Sometimes they look good, sometimes they don't. This is one of the things that surprises me watching them the last 2 years because they are big up front. They're pretty physical up front, at least, well, at times. And they've got really good linebackers. So I'm going to be honest. It took me a while to kind of figure out why they're not better stopping the run. And we'll get into that a little bit during this. But this is the matchup that this is their weakness against what has been a weakness for you for more of the season than it has been a strength. This is the area that we find out, Ryan. Did Notre Dame truly turn a corner on offense, especially running the ball against North Carolina, or is this a team that's still going to kind of struggle? Because BYU is more like Cal than they are North Carolina in that how they're coached, how they line up, and the fact that they're a big front. They're not nearly as good as Cal, but they are size-wise like Cal. And Notre Dame had a little bit of some problems with the size of Cal as far as moving them off the ball early in the game. Now, eventually they got it going. So I'm really intrigued by this matchup, Ryan. I gave the advantage to Notre Dame in my breakdown, and I have the written form of this breakdown online. But I am very curious to see if Notre Dame can turn the on-paper matchup into an actual, or turn the on-paper advantage into an actual advantage, because they're going to need to if they want to win this football game.
Over-encompassing is that we're going to see if Notre Dame offensively has taken the next step, Ryan. But to your point, and I agree 1,000,000,000%, this is the indicator right here, right? If this is the step forward that Notre Dame needs to take. We saw the offensive line look worlds better the last time they played 2 weeks ago now, or a week and a half, whatever you want to say. They looked a whole lot better against North Carolina. Is that a step, or is that a little bit of a falsity, I guess, is what we want to call it.
Yeah, it's a false sense of hope, right? Because you played a team that's really bad at stopping the run. Right?
Exactly. So this is a step where if Notre Dame's able to establish a run game and be consistent with it all day, I think that is a very positive step and an indicator that, yes, Notre Dame is taking a step forward. Because, like you said, this might not be quite a good team stopping the run as a Cal team, but this is still a pretty quality football team for the most part. They have talent up front is what I should say. You mentioned Tyler Batty early on, big defensive lineman. They have not been as good up front, I think, in a couple of years. I remember when they had Kyrus Tonga, who was like a big nose tackle. Like, he was a difficult player to move his last year with Zach Wilson. And I think that's when you saw the run defense at its best. I just don't think that they have quite the interior defensive lineman that they've had in the past. But to your point, when BYU's linebackers are left free and willing to run, I mean, Ben Bywater and Peyton Wilgar and Tooley and those guys, like, they're pretty decent football players, man. Like, there's some talent on that second level. So for me, to your point, Notre Dame's offensive line needs to dominate this football game. Right. They need to set a tone. We saw the flashes of how good Blake Fisher could be last week. He needs to be more consistent with it and take another step forward. And that goes for the whole offensive line and the entirety. Notre Dame has an advantage, I think, not even just rush offense versus rush defense for a second. They have the advantage offensive line versus defensive line, and they have to take advantage of it in this football game.
Because when you look at this BYU football team, Ryan, defensively, they've had a couple games they did struggle to stop the run from a yardage standpoint. They gave up 212 yards to Oregon. They gave up 204 to Utah State. They only gave up 152 to Baylor, but that was an overtime, and they only allowed Baylor to rush for 2.9 yards per carry. They held South Florida to 4 yards per carry and Wyoming to 3.7 yards per carry. Now, Wyoming's not a great rushing team, right? I mean, so, they're not a great offensive team, period. They're averaging about 153 yards a game right now rushing the football. So, Wyoming, that you held Wyoming to kind of to below where they are in this matchup, with where they are in their season total, but when I look at this team and I say, they haven't been getting ripped up with like a bunch of big runs. Oregon's really the only team that had much success. Utah State had like a couple 20 somethings, a couple big runs but there was also a lot of plays in that game where Utah State tried to run the ball on 3rd and 1, 4th and 1. It got stuffed. And so they came up big. So it's one of those things where, can you run on them? Yes. But the point is, you have to earn those yards. And that's why I like this matchup. It's not because, boy, this is a team that should stop you from running the ball. That's not what we're saying. What I am saying, though, is to run on them, you have to earn that. Oregon made a concerted effort to run the ball on them, and it worked. Baylor made a concerted effort to try to run on BYU, and it didn't work. Which one will this be? Will Notre Dame be able to go out and run? Because if they play like they did against Marshall up front, if they play like they did against Ohio State up front, if they play like they did early against Cal up front, they won't run the ball on BYU. If they play like they did against Cal or in the second half, and if they play like they did against North Carolina, then they will, which is, again, going to tell us just what this team has done. And I think the matchup that I'm most intrigued by, Ryan, is going to be the tackle matchup in the run game. Now, BYU does some really funky stuff up front. I shouldn't say funky. I mean, it's basically they're an odd front in their alignment, but they're a 4-down front team in their personnel. And they'll slide their fronts and do some evens, over and unders and stuff, but they do a lot of odd stuff. They'll base out of the odd, then shift out of it. And it puts their two big ends, who are, 275 plus pounds, on the Notre Dame tackles. And then they'll slant and they'll, kind of come off of them. At times they'll come off and just kind of read and react and try to occupy blockers to let the linebackers flow. That's what they do up front. Would you agree with that, Ryan?
100%.
And so that's why they get those big guys. So to me, the best way to beat that, and the teams that have had success against them, so Oregon, for example, really killed them with their zone stuff and their counter stuff. Because what they did is they got really good movement on the double teams, and they especially had success running outside. And Sean talked about this yesterday. Utah State, a lot of their success came on stretch and outside zone, because you get those big boys moving and then push forward, and it makes it a lot easier to then get off to the linebackers. Because what they're trying to do is keep your front occupied so the linebackers can read and flow to the ball. And for the most part, they're all pretty disciplined, instinctive guys. And so, especially their two inside guys. So I think that's going to be a key, Ryan, is can the tackles get movement on the big guys on the edge? I actually like this matchup up the middle for Notre Dame at center and guard. I think this should favor Notre Dame. Now, they've got to execute it. But I think the tackle matchup is going to be interesting, not just against the 5 techniques or the 4 eyes, but also when they have Beatty on the edge. So I'm very curious about that. And I think this is also a game where the Notre Dame tight ends are going to have to block well because of the way that BYU lines up. So we're going to learn a lot about the young tackles in this game, because that's the area where Notre Dame could have some problems, in my opinion, if they're not able to run the football.
I mean, like you said, they have size on the edge. I mean, you mentioned Tyler Beatty. They'll also run some under fronts, like you said, and they'll put like Peyton Wogar up on the line of scrimmage and let him be kind of that physical edge setter at 6'3", 245 plus pounds. Like, he's their biggest linebacker, right? So they're going to attack the edges a ton on Notre Dame. They're going to try to establish, but to your point, it hasn't really worked a ton, right? Like, they're a team that's built inside out. That's why they've been able to get run on a little bit. And, when I kind of did the breakdown of the defensive players for BYU, I mean, I kind of talked about that a little bit, Brian. Like, I think that there's a couple players like Tooley on the second level and even Bywater who are good athletes. But for the most part, your front seven is built around being physically dominant against the offensive line in theory, and using your length to occupy and to spill things, right? This is not a incredibly fleet of foot front seven, in my opinion. It's a lengthy physical front seven. So getting to the edges, I think, can be very advantageous to your opportunities to run the football. And I think that sets up perfectly for Chris Tyree. You know, like I want to see Chris Tyree matched up in space against these linebackers. Like I want to see there be a spot, and I know we're talking about rush defense and versus rush offense, but even in opportunities for Notre Dame to just get Chris Tyree out in space as a pass player, in a run player, because I think that you can take advantages getting him isolated against a guy like a Peyton Wilgar who wants to play in the box on the line of scrimmage. Like that's not where his bread is buttered, right? So I think that that's the biggest thing is you always want to make the opposition uncomfortable and working the edges, getting into space, running the football off tackle. Like those things I think could really loosen up this defense and make them extremely uncomfortable, in my opinion.
And when you run up the middle, you have to get a body on their backers. That's when their backers are able to fly downhill and ram into the linemen, that's when they have success. I'm also curious, Ryan, to see if they play more of Keenan Peely this week. Now, they'll play like 5 different linebackers a lot. Tooley and Bywater are good players. I think Bywater is a more inside kind of guy. Tooley is rangy. Obviously, Peyton Wilger's an outside kind of guy. Peely's the one guy that I think can be a bit of a thumper inside. Some games they play him a decent amount. Some games that he's not much of a factor. I think this is a game where if you watch Notre Dame against North Carolina and Cal, you got to be thinking to yourself, we got to get him more involved in this because he's a guy that can match up a little bit. So I'm curious to see if they try to match up in that regard against Notre Dame, because the one thing that's weird about BYU, they list like 15 different starters. And like I have Ryan do this. Ryan does this recruiting comparison, and you know and so the one he sends me, he's got like 15. I'm like, dude, what is this? Like, what are you doing? Like, you've done this before. I know. And then I looked at their depth chart and I was like, oh, this is absurd. So, but the point is they can get into a lot of different looks, Ryan, and that's the point. And I'm curious to see just exactly how they decide to match up against Notre Dame. I have a feeling based on sort of what they've done so far this year or what Notre Dame, I should say, has done so far this year. I think we're going to see them be a lot more aggressive with their linebackers crashing and having their safeties protect, because right now Notre Dame has not presented the kind of pass threat with their receivers to scare BYU. And if I'm BYU, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, I'm going to make them beat me throwing the ball down the field. They're not going to beat me with because what bringing the running backs down into the box does, right? It allows them to, the safeties, and not only allows them to protect against the run game, but then allows them to be in position to see and run with the running backs in the pass game, which that has been a weapon. They also, which we'll get into, so here in the next segment, but I think that also presents them some run game chances for success, which then allows them to trigger the linebackers more. I think we might, because they're not a heavy blitz team. They're not a heavy run stunt team either, Ryan Lee. They'll like do a guy, but they're not like a heavy attack, bring 7 guys type of defense. I think we might see more of that this week. I do. I think we might see a little bit more of that, because I don't think they think that they can just sit back and run, let Notre Dame kind of come off and get their big linemen going, because BYU has a pretty good sized defensive line, but this is still a massive Notre Dame front. Yes. Right. And they're going to watch what this line did to Cal in the second half. And Cal has a big defensive line. And they're going to look at that and say, Zeke Correll was moving that 330-pound kid off the ball in the second half. You know what I mean? Like, Jared Patterson was pushing, Ray Vahasek around against North Carolina, Zeke Correll and Jared Patterson. And that kid's 310 pounds. So I think what they've seen the last 6 quarters from Notre Dame, I think they know Notre Dame is capable of moving their big boys. So I don't think that they can just play the way that they've been in recent weeks. At least that's something I think Notre Dame needs to be prepared for in this game.
Well, and I also think that you understand that that's how Notre Dame best functions, right? Like, it's not even just the fact of like that they have been doing well on the offensive line. It's also to your point, right? Like, Notre Dame has not been able to create explosive plays in the pass game consistently. So why would I give them the benefit of the doubt if I'm the BYU defensive coordinator and say like, oh, but like I got to protect against the pass? Why? Make them prove that they can do it. If they can't prove it, then you have to negate what Notre Dame does best right now. And in your opinion, like your perspective is the last 6 quarters, Notre Dame has had its bread buttered moving the line of scrimmage and running the football. Those are what everything has kind of been based out of, and utilizing these running backs. So for a Notre Dame offensive line that, again, goes, 317, 308, 308, 319 or something like that, and 327 or whatever. Like, it's somewhere in those ballparks, right? Across the offensive line. It's a big offensive line for Notre Dame. And what you want to cause havoc for them is to make them have to move off of their track and to readjust their mindset and readjust their movements on the fly. You don't want them to just kind of like inside zone step. You're on your track. You're working up to the second level. You're comboing. Everything is just kind of on schedule, right? When you make a Blake Fisher second guess himself at 327 pounds where he has to readjust on the fly, that's where mistakes happen. So creating havoc up front with movement, I think, to your point, Brian, is 100% right, because they know that Notre Dame wants to get off and they want to get a massive push and they want to establish the run game, because you have not shown in the biggest games, for the most part, against the Oregons. I know people want to point to Oregon all day, right? Oregon just out-physicaled this BYU defense. They did all day. That's the recipe for success in a vacuum. And I think BYU also knows that, like, hey, there's been a team on the schedule, Power 5 team, a good football team, that gave Notre Dame the recipe to beat us, right? So we need to negate what they do well, and that's playing great up front.
I think this is where I think a lot of the misconceptions about BYU exist, because that's the only game a lot of people have seen BYU play. And I would say, imagine what someone's opinion of Notre Dame is if the only game they've seen them play this year was against Marshall. Because Marshall pushed Notre Dame around on defense, right? I mean, does that mean that Marshall's a better team than Notre Dame or a more physical team? Or does that mean Notre Dame played like crap that day? That's not what you typically see from BYU. And like I saw somebody even in the chat said that there's a size disadvantage or a discrepancy between Notre Dame and BYU. No, there's not. BYU starting nose guard is 320 pounds. They're starting 3 technique. He also plays some 5. Lorenzo Fautua is 310 pounds. Their backup nose guard's 305. Their 2 end players, John Nelson's 275. He looks bigger than that, because him and Tyler Beatty are both listed at 275. To me, John Nelson looks at least 10, 15 pounds bigger than Tyler Beatty. Yep. And then Earl 202 Mariner is 288 pounds. He's another defensive end that'll play a bunch in this game. And so this is a big front. I think the thing that they're going to realize is this is one of those games, to your point, Ryan, where they don't have the size advantage with their front. And what they've been able to do when they have had success at running the ball is those big guys occupy blockers. Cal tried that. Cal's a very similar team. Now, they're very different schematically, but they're similar philosophically when it comes to their run defense, Ryan. And what I mean by that is use your big boys up front to eat up blocks and let your smart, instinctive linebackers run free. That's what Cal likes to do. And Notre Dame didn't let him do that in the second half, and that's why Notre Dame ran the ball effectively. BYU is going to realize, okay, I don't think we can – maybe they tried early, but they're going to have something to counter that. And now, if Notre Dame can't push those guys off the ball, then they're going to struggle to run the ball effectively, because then that allows the linebackers to read and react as opposed to being forced to stunt. If they can get those guys, if they can force Cal to trigger their linebackers more, which then results in somebody's got to replace them, right? Which means more safeties triggering down in the box, more single high coverage, then that exposes them and other stuff on the perimeter. So the whole game plan, run, pass, all of it, screen, all of it is going to be dependent upon Notre Dame winning this matchup. They can and they should, but again, this is what we've talked about all week, Ryan. Yes, they should, but we cannot forget that less than a month ago, this is the same team that couldn't run on Ohio State. This is the same team that couldn't run on Marshall, right? So they've got to prove. Notre Dame is still in show-me mode. Beating up on North Carolina doesn't erase the first 10 quarters of the season. You know what I mean? And that's where I need to see it. Can they do it? Yes. Is it going to be easy? No. And that's what I think this matchup is. But I still think on paper and in practicality, Notre Dame has the advantage over BYU. They just have to exert it. And that's what's going to make this really interesting. Because the thing is now, teams now have a bit more data on who Notre Dame is without Tyler Buchner from a running standpoint.
Yep.
Okay, so, hey, this is what they did. We saw what they did against Cal. We saw the adjustments that they did against North Carolina. They're running less duo. They're running more inside zone stretch. I even kind of think that they saw a little bit of mid zone against North Carolina too. And so they're now adjusting. So Notre Dame has to be prepared for that. And so this is why we say this is a big game for Notre Dame. Because if Notre Dame can run the ball effectively on BYU, Ryan, that tells me that they have in fact turned the corner, and it's not about beating up on a bad North Carolina defense anymore. That's why I think this is an important part of this matchup.
And I think you'll have a big indication on it early, if I'm being honest. Like, there's some games where, like, it's slow to get going, and then you just kind of chip away. Like, I think Notre Dame, if they're going to be successful running the football, you're going to know it in the first couple series. Like, I think that they are going to try to establish it early because, again, we're going to take a look at the BYU pass defense. It's a completely different story than what the run defense is at right now, right? So Notre Dame knows that in theory, with how they've been playing the last game and a half, that they do have the advantage going into this one. But at the end of the day, to your point, it's show me season. It's show me season right now, man. But I think that the first couple of drives, you will know very early, is Notre Dame going to have a nice day running the football, or is it going to be a little bit of a struggle? I think we'll have that indication pretty early on.
I want to see how the line comes off the ball. We like the first drive against North Carolina, Notre Dame threw on 2 of their first 3 plays. So it was like, okay, you don't really know what's going on, 3 and out. Okay, what's happening here? The next drive, they didn't even score on the next drive, I don't think. Didn't they go for it on 4th down and not get it? I'm trying to remember how that game it was a little bit of a weird weekend for me. But you could even see that next drive, even early. It's like one of those things where sometimes there's games where even though it's close early, you kind of feel like it's not. Yeah, they missed a field goal on their second drive. And, I remember kind of sitting back watching like when Alabama played Michigan State in the playoff in 2015. It was like, what, 10-0 at halftime? Yeah. But you're like, this is not a 10-point game. Like, they have so thoroughly outplayed them. Like the first year that Ohio State and Michigan played, I think wasn't like 13-10 at halftime. And you're like, this is not a close game. And then second half, it ended up being like 42-13 or something like that. And you just watch, you're like, the score is not indicative of how this game is playing out. And I kind of felt like after the first drive of each game, of each team, so UNC had their first drive and Notre Dame had their first drive, after that, you immediately saw that Notre Dame was going to impose their will on North Carolina on both sides of the ball. It was just about, okay, can they execute? Right? We hadn't seen that in previous games. And it wasn't even just the competition stinks. And this is why we talked about this after the game. It was, you could see it in the footwork. You could see it in the hand play. You could see them hitting Carolina and then driving their feet after contact. That's not relevant to, are they good or the other team good or not? That's a you thing. And that's why I say it's more about Notre Dame. And so will we see that? Those are the things that we are going to kind of see in this game, Ryan, is we're going, and that, to your point, we're going to know early, is Notre Dame coming off the ball with force? Are they coming off the ball and driving their feet? Are they working those combos well? Are they getting a push to the second level? Even if they're, 3 runs, because that first drive, they were like 3 runs, 2 runs, but you're like, you know what? They're about to pop a couple because you could just see them getting that push. And I think that's where I think, Ryan, you're spot on about how this is going to go. It wasn't until the 3rd drive that Notre Dame really started to kind of get going. And it really wasn't until the 3rd drive after the Drew Pine scramble that they started to get going. But you just knew the foundation was being laid. And that's what I think is what we're going to see early. Now, it may not pay off right away. Maybe they don't go right up and down the field the first 2 drives and put touchdowns on the board. I hope they do. But I think you will see right away if that's the case. And that's why this is again, we're going to spend a little bit more time on this matchup than all the others, because I think this one is the biggest key to this game and could be the biggest key to the run. Because, again, this isn't just about BYU. This is if you do what you're capable of on BYU, then, okay, watch out, Stanford. Watch out, UNLV. Watch out, Syracuse, because this team's about to get rolling. And that's why this is important.
And the first couple games too, Brian, like the offensive line struggled. Like we documented that, right? It's been obviously better. And for the first time this season, they put it pretty much on a full game scope against North Carolina, where you're like, okay, they took a big step. They played good football. But I think there's still 2 outcomes that could happen here, if I'm being honest, right? One outcome is that Notre Dame is like, oh, wow, we did it. Like now we can get rolling or a little bit. And that could go two ways. One way is we're feeling ourselves a little bit too much and we're not preparing ourselves adequately to play against a better team. And then the other way is that now our confidence is exuding, it's through the roof, and now we are going to dominate moving forward, right? So I am interested to see what the Notre Dame offensive line looks early on in this game. I want to see if they have the same tenacity and demeanor to themselves, or if they think they've, I don't want to say arrived, because they only won one football game in a somewhat impressive fashion, but I think that there can be a false sense of like, wow, that was pretty easy, if we're being honest, right? So I'm really interested to see just how much of a, not an emphasis, but how this Notre Dame offensive line comes in and how they play early on, because I'm hoping that you see the aggressiveness, the physicality. If you do, I think Notre Dame is going to be in a good spot at the end of this football game. But again, that is something that we need to see on the field before we feel good about it.